Welcome to Pioneers in Payments, where payments experts share their insights. Now, here's our host, Donna Blum.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Pioneers in Payments. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Cole Augustine. Well, Cole, to get us started, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your background in the payments industry and also your consulting organization?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I have kind of an odd background. So I refer to myself as a bit of a dilettante. So despite my youthful appearance, I spent the better part of about 20 years in banking before leaving banking in, I think it was 2019. So I've been away for close to 5 years now. So the first kind of half of my career, I stumbled into financial services. I had no idea I was interested in it or any of this. And, about a year in, I went from kind of retail banking and stumbled into treasury management implementation. So working with just large commercial customers for a large bank who had just these complex payment services. And so I'd come out of consumer banking and I was like, well, wow, this is complicated. It's interesting. We're doing really fascinating things for our customers. And the conversation is so different than what I'd experienced before. But I kind of came from a sales background. And this was way back in the day when I worked for US Bank. I sort of wound my way into sales. And spent about 10 years in total doing sales for treasury management, purchasing and commercial cards, some international, so cross-border payments, trade finance. But generally speaking, by title, I was a treasury management sales consultant or advisor. And somewhere kind of mid-career, I realized I loved international banking. I'd worked for a couple international banks, and I'm a bit of a nerd, so I wanted to kind of go beyond sales and really understand like how can I get deeper into all these things that I'm interested in. And so I got lucky. I got a LinkedIn note from a guy at Capital One who 20 years ago, they were just that credit card company. They weren't this giant bank, right? Saying, hey, I need a person to build out a trade finance business. Are you interested? And I went, yeah, one, I don't know how he found me to this day. But so I packed up, moved to New York, and I became Capital One's first ever trade finance product manager. So letters of credit and collection. So think not the payment, but the things that intermediate the payment or ensure a payment gets made if certain other things happen. And then over the years, I picked up cross-border payments, foreign currency. I was lucky enough to be the person who implemented Reg E or Dodd-Frank 1073, the consumer cross-border remittance stuff. And then I left Capital One, spent another 5 or so years working for regional banks. Most of that time, again, product management, doing international banking, so treasury, trade, foreign exchange. How does money move both across borders, but how do we ensure those payments get made in situations of uncertainty? Um, and then I left, like I said, I left banking in 2019. Interestingly, turned down an opportunity to go run the foreign exchange group for a bank that was really early in the crypto market. And I decided I'm going to get out of banking, and I went to be a payments product manager for a company that did public transit ticketing, which doesn't sound that interesting until you start to understand transit or utility payments and really just all the complexity of it. And so, for better or worse, the company went under about 6 months after I joined. Um, spent a little more time at a fintech, and then I've had my consulting firm now for about the last 3 years, with a short stint as a product manager at Alchemy, doing digital banking, business banking technology. But since kind of setting up the shop on my own, it's really been just kind of a whirlwind. After leaving a fintech who was doing foreign currency payments, I ended up working for a company that I'm consulting with again right now called Impello Global, who is an export credit advisor. So they're U.S. Exim Bank's top broker for 2023. So basically, if you need to insure your accounts receivable, your foreign accounts receivable, there are actually insurance products to do that, which again, pin in this for payment topics, right? Insurance and payments don't talk today, but they could. Um, and so I'm doing that. I just finished up an engagement with a customer where I replaced about 80,000 debit cards to a new issuer, and then switched over and quickly moved to connecting directly to the Fed for a FedLine Advantage connection. And then most recently, in addition to kind of the day-to-day consulting business, where really I try to focus on coming in, solving a problem, and really empowering a team to carry on without me, as opposed to coming in and being sort of this person who you need there constantly, right? People are talented, they can be taught, they can learn the skill set, and they can carry that forward. So that's been where I've been spending the bulk of my time the last year or so. With the caveat, as I mentioned last time, that I just picked up another contract that's really interesting. Again, back with Impello Global on their structured trade advisory side. And my main focus is actually going to be using basically a series of things like government guarantees, tax credits, payment guarantees, payment purchase agreements, etc., to structure large clean energy transactions, mostly within sort of the U.S. and U.S. territory. So a lot of that will be things like U.S. Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico, which again, energy is also another just fascinating area for payments. And then of course some kind of domestic stuff in here in the U.S. So, again, I know that was probably a 20-minute soliloquy, but I do a lot of weird stuff, and I really, really just enjoy understanding kind of how everything fits together and having conversations with folks like yourself, Donna.
Well, I just love your diverse experience and your passion about just all that's going on in the industry. And when you were mentioning your consulting, one of your roles was to basically educate
Yeah,
the
yeah,
staff so that you didn't have to be a fixture there, but you could train this. And I just was thinking about, how if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, right? But if you train them to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. And that's what you're doing, right? You're going in and
yeah.
you're training their staff so that they can do what you've taught them to do without you being involved. So that's awesome.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting. I think kind of coming out of, a world of risk management, right? I think a lot about how to hedge risk. And if we as consultants make ourselves kind of the central figure of everything, to use a cliche that I used to hear in some of my corporate days, it's one neck to wring. Whereas if you're really sort of empowering, not only are you going to start to see, and you hear this a lot in product development, right? The term systems thinking, right? How does each individual component of a larger system work? And then what happens if each of those pieces break down? Well, if I, especially as somebody who's not really officially part of that system all the time, am such a core component, what happens if I get hit by a bus, right?
Right.
So focus on that system, and in almost all cases, each individual cog, if we're cogs, is generally pretty darn talented and competent. And if something's going wrong, like in most cases, you can talk through that without a whole lot of work. Not to sound too cavalier about organizational change, but it's both much harder and much easier than I think we think it is.
Yeah. That's good. But that's actually a good thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. The easy part, anyways. The hard part, not so much. Well, except for us consultant types.
Well, we had some conversations sort of leading up to today's conversation
Yeah,
about just all that's going on in the industry and the disruption, and especially with regards to financial services organizations or banks. How many of them are still operating with technology that was deployed
yeah,
um, decades ago, really, and how there's so much happening in the industry today that really some kind of a shift or modernization is required. So maybe we can kind of have a conversation a little bit in that space. But the general goal is to basically distill all that's happening in the industry today and leave our audience with, a few like sound bites or,
yeah.
just jewels that they can take with them to help them make decisions as they go forward. So, let's talk right now about what you perceive to be the biggest trend in the payments space today.
Yeah, yeah. So, this is I haven't watched all of the other podcasts yet, but of those I've seen so far, I haven't heard anyone say this yet. But it sounds a little cliche to say, but honestly, I think the biggest trend in payments today is payments. And for some context there, in my 25 or so years in financial services, if you are tuned into the innovation within the industry, it tends to be very, very broad, right? And some of this is where you sit, right? What's the cliche? Where you sit or where you stand depends on where you sit. So if I sat in treasury management or foreign exchange or trade, I certainly had a biased sample, but in almost any conversation I have with almost any individual, if the topic of payments comes up in any context, that person will want to dive into it. Whether I'm at the store and I tap my watch a couple times, that's a conversation. Same thing with the phone. If I bring out a check, okay, I haven't brought out a check. And sometimes if I bring out cash, which is, less used, that even becomes a conversation, right? So, and this is an interesting question. I don't know if ultimately the focus on payments as a discipline, as opposed to solely payments as a, I don't know, as a means to an end, is a good thing or not. And frankly, I don't know that it really matters. We'll get there eventually. But yeah, again, payments themselves is the trend. There's so much money going to payments, so many startups, and I think there's just so much opportunity, in my opinion, to really look not just at the payments themselves, but what's around that payment and really bring some opportunity to market.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting use cases and innovative ways to do payments today. And it's a moving target too, right? Like there's new stuff coming out every
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
I've heard of like the glasses or gosh, I don't even know.
Oh,
There's
I was going to say just on that topic, one of the things that people who spend time with me hear me talk about a lot is access devices, and that term is not one that I used a lot until I went to work in public transit. And so when people say an access device, usually what they mean is a payment card, right? It's what's the official definition? Any card, plate, code, I wrote this down, or account number, other means to access an account that can be used alone or in conjunction with another access device to obtain money, goods, services, or anything else of value. Now, there's so much emphasis, right? And we've always done, so I came out of Treasury, we've always done a pretty good job at electronic or account to account payments as long as we have the information. But when you start to look at how are we actually accessing that network, things are really starting to get interesting, right? We've got so many new technologies. The transit company I did had this really interesting mix where they had a Bluetooth with a near field like NFC or RFID. I'm not a technology expert, but basically at two different stages, as you're walking towards the bus, information would be read off of your device, and only at the point when those two things matched would a transaction be initiated. So there's a lot of thought that I personally am putting into payments around like not just what are the rails themselves, but how do we access the rails, and what if anything could be ubiquitous, if I can speak, but also, and again, this comes out of the public transit world, things get pretty dystopian pretty fast when you start to think access devices, right? Like there's nothing super nefarious about a payment rail, but when you start to think about, okay, facial recognition, right? Or, I want to give, a homeless person the ability to ride the bus for free. I actually was toying with this idea and decided against it. What if we could give them a Discover card? It was going to be with their photo printed on it and a thumbprint, so only they could access it. Now, there's some pretty cool technology in that. It ultimately gets to the goal, but then you start to kind of peel back the layers of like what are all of the unintended consequences of using access devices to get to the rails in these ways, and it gets weird. So anyway, I'm gonna pause for a second, but yeah, I guess to wrap back around, like the payments themselves are the trend, and I think the access device is one of the areas that is somewhat lagging behind the rails themselves, which really are improving.
yes, that's great. It's fun to think about, right? The
I love
future's
that stuff.
now.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're kind of talking about like the top trend is payments.
Yeah, really.
And there are obviously all kinds of opportunities for organizations that process payments. But what would
Mhm.
you say is the greatest opportunity?
So I was really trying to think about this, And I heard one of the other guests mention payroll, and I'm going to kind of extend that. So the guest you'd had on, I'm going to apologize, I don't remember who said this, but they referenced earned wage access, right? So W-2 workers, I've already earned my wage. I want to get, I'm going to get paid in 2 weeks, but why can't I get paid now, right? I already know I'm going to get paid. And that has improved significantly around kind of the payday lending market, but it's still not generally viewed as kind of a low cost and good alternative. But, and I think we talked about this before, there was a company some years back that went under for totally unrelated reasons out of Australia called Greensill Capital that was taking what I call an approved payables finance approach to payroll. So in supply chain finance, there's this whole industry where, I as a company, right, I've got a payroll file. Well, forget payroll. I've got a vendor payment file, right? I'm going to go pay 100 vendors. Well, I can upload that to the bank and they can execute those payments for me. But if I have the right structure with my bank, I can upload to the bank. My bank can then reach out to all of my vendors, let's say 30 days before that payment's due, and say, hey, pay you today if you want. It's going to cost you a little bit, but we can make that happen. And because you're often dealing with the credit risk of a larger, kind of more sophisticated company, the one who's actually making all those payments, that gives you arbitrage, right? The cost of credit should be lower because I, the employee, am not the one who's risking not paying you. It's that my employer, call it an Intel or an Apple or something, right? They say they're going to pay me and then choose not to. And so while I think payroll is vendor payments are an extremely salient thing, what this company Greensill had done is they actually tried to apply that same structure to payroll. They said, upload your payroll file 2 weeks early. And there's all sorts of other things that can be done on the other side to sort of cover the risk of non-payment and stuff, but like there's some magic there. So the short answer to a very long answer that I just gave you is I think the biggest opportunity is to bridge the gap between when a buyer wants to make a payment and when a seller wants to get paid, and find ways that are integrated into the payment process or payment flow itself that allow that gap to be bridged by an intermediary.
That's great. That really kind of condenses it. So thank you. Okay, so that's the greatest opportunity today. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the flip side of that. What would you say is the greatest challenge?
I would say and I said this earlier, but I would go back to the access device. I think access to a rail in a way that works for everybody. And the way that I kind of like to go through this, right, is to strip through what are some of the other payment means and why are they great, right? So we all hate cash, right? I mean, I hate cash as much or more than anybody, but I wrote a short white paper on this a while back, and it really, in going through these processes, right, you start to have these epiphanies. And what I realized is cash is unique. And, I know you've had Reed from the Faster Payments Council on. And so he comes out from Walmart, right? And so I like to use the term breakage. So retailers have this concept of breakage where some amount of stuff is going to get broken or lost or stolen, and you kind of build that in. Well, cash is really unique because a dollar bill, it is at the same time an access device. I can give you this thing. It's a store of value. It's a ledger. This thing actually ties back to some other ledger. And based on how it's structured, it allows for breakage. So if I see a dollar bill just burn up, if the government wanted to just reprint another dollar, that's not going to do anything to the money supply, right? Because we know that. And so there's a really kind of interesting confluence of how this really all comes together in order to sort of bridge the gap between if I want to give you cash, I don't need an internet connection. I don't need access to a ledger. I don't need to know how much money's in your bank account. I don't need anything else other than to hand you this thing. Checks are a little bit of that, right? Like there's, again, I I like checks even less than I like cash, but checks do provide some of that sort of asynchronous value with some level of assurance that has been really hard to replicate in these other mechanisms. And then you kind of go beyond that, and pretty much everything else that I can think of requires an internet connection. So maybe again, kind of as I wrap through talking through access devices, finding a means to effectively access and manage a payment ledger that does not require a constant live internet connection is the hardest problem to solve.
Gosh, I never really thought about that. But yeah, it's so true. I mean, everything's moving to digital. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, if you're a homeless person, you certainly don't have access
Yeah, yeah.
to the internet to do it. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about.
So anyway, so it is interesting to kind of step back and realize, right? In many cases, we think of kind of these underserved communities as not always having access to certain things, right? And that is very, very true broadly. One of the interesting things I found coming out of public transit is, people who are, homeless or unhoused, whatever the working term is these days. Uh, they often will have access to a mobile phone. Maybe it's a smartphone, maybe it's a, lo-fi kind of burner phone, who knows, but it's not uncommon to have access to a mobile phone. What gets really interesting in payments for these communities is sort of the and not to be too snarky, but what's often referred to as kind of the nanny state, right? Is how do we choose to what we allow different people to do? And so the problem itself, in some cases, is pretty easy, right? I want to give people access to free public transit, or I want to give them access to this or that, then you just do it. But if you want to sort of prohibit the ability to, and this was what we were dealing with transit, right? Bus pass costs you $100. I can sell that on the street for 50, and then I can go buy something illicit with that. And so trying to find a way to sort of demonetize or defang that instrument, that item, but still preserve the value to that individual without violating their civil rights. Again, just a fascinating thing. But this is all to say, like, I don't know what it will be, but the idea of that M-Pesa network and the ability to kind of leapfrog, I think there could be something. I'm just not going to be the one who figures out what that thing will be.
Well, somebody will, I'm sure, eventually.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
okay, so my favorite question is to, just take your sum total of knowledge and give our audience one silver bullet piece of advice.
Yeah. So this is the question I think I gave the most thought to, and I'm sure most of your guests do, right? Because it's like I want to add something both valuable but unique. One of the things that really stands out to me, and I'm gonna butcher a Bertrand Russell quote, so philosopher Bertrand Russell. And I'm going to preface this that this quote sounds very ageist. I'm going to reframe it after I give you the original quote. So the quote says, if the elderly but distinguished scientist says something is possible, they are almost certainly correct. If they say something is impossible, they are very probably wrong. And the first time I heard that, I had this moment where I went, how many times have I had somebody who's not an expert in payments or trade or foreign exchange or fintech come to me and ask me a question, and I've dismissed that question out of hand because I'm like, that's not how it works, as opposed to pausing and say, how might we, or why, what would it take for that to work? So this is kind of a joint piece of advice, but listen to those people who ask questions, whether they're, you know, just super naive and have no experience in your industry or any industry, or if they're an expert in a different field. Listen to their questions because there's something there that you are not yet seeing. And then the other side of I said it was going to be a two-part. So first part is just listen, right? And then the second part is actually take the time to go through an exercise and understand what would it take for this to be true, and you can come up with some things that are just magical, right? So anyway, that's my advice. Listen and get people to expand upon things that sound like they're bad ideas at first.
Well, that's how innovation happens, right? Every new thing started out as an idea, right? At some point. Yeah, yeah, I love that. Great advice. Well, Cole, before I let you go, I would like to make sure that our audience knows how to learn more about your consulting organization
Sure.
and the work that you do, or how they might just reach out to you.
Absolutely. So LinkedIn, honestly, I think for many of us tends to be the easiest. I managed to be the first Cole Augustine. So just first name Cole, Cole, last name Augustine, and then the LinkedIn address is just the first and last name after the forward slash. Email is good as well. It's my first name Cole, last name Augustine, no dots or anything, at galactictrade.co, so .co. And then I do have a website, galactictrade.co. I will be very candid and say I keep getting customers. Maybe I'm gloating. I don't know. I keep getting customers before I really spend the time on my website. So it's actually still behind a wall right now. So there may be a chance that by the time this podcast comes out, you may get something if you go there. Um, but if you don't, you're welcome to hassle me, the royal you out there in the audience.
Well, that's okay. You've got your priorities straight, taking care of your clients before polishing up your website. So that makes sense to me. Well,
Absolutely.
Cole, I just want to thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate all just your passion and the advice that you provided. And I am sure that my audience appreciates it as well. So just want to thank you for your time and thank everybody for watching.
Thanks so much, Donna. This was an absolute blast, and I'm honored to be part of this group.